Hello everyone, here's another video on Adobe optimization of scanned files with regard to the Obama birth certificate. Now there are some claims being made that some Adobe features in the PDF file you can download from the White House site, or some properties of the pixels you can see in that file are definite proof that this file is a forgery, which would basically mean that, for instance, a different person's birth certificate was used, the original names, numbers, and dates deleted and typed over with data referring to Barack Obama, and this forgery then released by the White House as the PDF. And then friendly people on the internet come along, discover the features in Adobe, and expose the forgery. First of all, let me state, if there's any kind of optimization, compression, enhancement, etc., that doesn't change the content in terms of numbers, names, dates, etc., that is not a forgery, even if it might not be what you expect or want, and the following still applies, that it is a certified true copy. With things like digital watermarks, checksums, signatures, etc., you can in principle verify whether a scanned file or other electronic document was modified after it was saved, but you can never prove the truth of its contents unless the process of copying it from a piece of paper is vetted and certified, which is the job of a state registrar. What we can investigate are all these claims that properties in the PDF establish definite proof, that is, mean there is no other possible explanation than that the certificate was forged, that is, the numbers and dates were changed by typing them over or assembling them from different documents. It is not possible to determine by investigating the electronic file whether that original paper was genuine. Again, the registrar has to do that. We can see some simple routine processing might explain the features of the PDF that are claimed as proof, and it will be very important when doing that we always run our processing across the entire file, never touch any individual element, and basically we treat the file like any other file. We wouldn't know whether this file is going to be special and we have to manipulate it differently. We treat all the files the same, like mass processing would happen in some large organization. So in order to do this, I've investigated the features that are claimed as proof of forgery, that is, data alteration, and I've tried to reproduce them with a sample document that was scanned and processed, and I will also use the AP version of the birth certificate as a sample. So the idea is, if we process these two completely different files, which have no connection between them, in a similar way and get similar results, then we can assume that in a mass processing where people don't care whether this is the birth certificate of John Doe or Barack Obama, you would get the same results. So far we have had as claims as definite proof of forgery, which leave no other explanation than that the data were altered. Things like there are layers in Illustrator, which people pretty soon found out is just something that happens when you optimize scans in Acrobat. The next thing was, well, layers are in groups that has to be forged, same thing. There were clipping paths, still the same function creates that. Well, there were linked files, which means it's supposed to be assembled from different documents. But it turns out, again, if you do optimize scan, that's what you get. Rotation and transform history, same story again. Finally, differently scaled elements. The background had a different scaling of the foreground elements. Well, again, this was instantly reproduced by scanning a sample document and just hitting that one button, Optimize Scan, in Acrobat. Now, there are a lot of people out there who basically just know that this document has to be a forgery, so they will just continue looking for some other feature that are going to be definite proof that there's no other explanation than data alteration for this special properties they find in that document. So the most recent thing I've heard is chromatic aberration, or lack thereof, of the document, which is supposed to prove that definitely the data were altered. Well, I'm going to look at these two documents and try to reproduce with plain processing across the whole file what kind of results we get, and whether there is a much simpler explanation than a great big conspiracy to forge these documents. So these are going to be my files. Here is the JPEG file of the Obama birth certificate, which you can get from AP. This is the PDF everyone's been talking about for comparison. And this is the basically John Doe version. It's just a completely newly created file printed out to laser printer, filled out, and scanned again. So basically, we're going to compare the results of processing these two files and see if we can get similar effects to what we see in this existing PDF. Now, for the beginning, I'll look at these files in Illustrator. So we can see here in the PDF file from the White House all of these features that have been called proof of tampering. So we can see the layers, and that the layers contain clipping paths, and we can see the so-called linked files, which are listed here. We can see that these elements have a rotation history, and we can see that there's scaling, and the background may be scaled differently than the foreground. And these are basically, so here's the background. These are basically all of these features which are supposedly, this one's scaled differently. These are all the features which are supposedly definite proof that only deliberate forgery and alteration of data can create this file. Now, if we look at our sample scan, it has exactly one external link. It has one layer that's just the image element. It has no clipping paths and no other stuff. The same applies to the file from the AP website. So basically, this reminds everyone that having these kinds of layer and link elements is normal in the first place, even for a plain JPEG. Okay, so to start with the discussion of the so-called chromatic aberration, you can see this here. There's kind of color rim around the letters, and there's some color differences inside the letter, which is also not just chromatic aberration, but color noise from the sensor of a scanner. This is indeed normal, and you expect to see it in any color scan. Obviously, if you convert the scan to grayscale, the color effect will go away, but you will still see this kind of speckiness. And so the argument was that because you have this kind of chromatic aberration in the AP version, for instance, but you do not have that in the PDF version, here you see it's kind of solid color, that this is definite proof of forgery and data alteration. The funny thing is that basically those two files can, show the same numbers and names and dates and whatever, so you would ask yourself, if somebody was forging this, why would they succeed once in creating a file which is perfect with regard to chromatic aberration and all that other stuff, and in the other case they would produce this file where supposedly you can instantly recognize that it was forged and the data altered. That's a bit strange, but well, sometimes maybe people just fail. Well, but what we are going to do now is we're going to see if we can reproduce these kinds of effects by processing the innocent sample file and the AP version. So I'm going to start out with the AP version, which I've opened here. And the first thing I've always been doing is optimize scan. So I'm just going to use the default values. Okay, so I have to find my place again here. So already this looks a lot sharper and a lot more solid. There's almost no color left of that chromatic aberration, but it's not quite anywhere near what we see in the PDF released in the White House, where it's completely solid. So maybe there's more than this one click to the whole thing. So what I tried then was just actually doing something which I've never done in the other videos so far. A lot of people have been talking about OCR, and I have not used that so far. I will now try it for the first time and use clear scan, which is the option. I'll just use it like, I'll use this default, which I see here. Okay, let's see where we end up. Wow, definitely this looks extremely solid, and there is no chromatic aberration anymore. Now, it doesn't look one-to-one exactly like the PDF from the White House, but we wouldn't really expect it to look exactly the same because obviously we're using a different document to start out from. I don't think that they used the AP JPEG downloaded from the AP website to start. And also we don't know what settings they were maybe exactly using when they processed these documents. What we demonstrate here is that absence of chromatic aberration is not proof of forgery and data alteration. There is no way around that, because here we have absence of chromatic aberration with no forgery or data alteration. Also, look at this. Now, one of these so-called smoking guns, which supposedly prove that data was added later on, is that some of the writing looks very different. And this is exactly what you get here. Some of the writing is very, very solid, and some of it is fuzzy. Again, the presence of this different kind of writing, with some of it being fuzzy and some of it being sharp, is not proof of forgery and data alteration. Now we're going to do exactly the same processing with our innocent John Doe file. Again, I'll be using optimization. Now here, watch, you saw it rotate. It was a bit slanted before, now it's straight. Also, you can see right away that the text is looking very, very solid. Okay, and since the principle was that we were going to treat all files exactly the same, like we would do if we were mass processing hundreds of birth certificates without knowing which one is the president and which one is John Doe, I'm going to OCR this in exactly the same way. Default settings, here we go. Okay, again, we see there's absolutely no chromatic aberration left. And we see a very interesting effect again. These letters having different colors. Again, you will see in many of the conspiracy videos, this is supposedly one of the smoking guns, where, like people say, this letter S, it must have come from a different source or a different file. It must be a forgery. It must be tampered. So here we are really seeing that these effects can all be explained by 2 clicks, which would be completely plausible for mass processing of files in any organization that has hundreds or thousands or millions of old paper documents and wants to digitize them. Now, I'm not saying this is exactly what they did when they processed these files, because I don't know what kind of software they were using. Actually, in the PDF from Whitehouse, it mentions Quartz PDF, which is something built in on the Mac. Now, I don't have a Mac. But what this proves is, first of all, that you can get all of these effects, like removal of chromatic aberration, in a routine kind of processing. And what it clearly shows is that just the absence of something like chromatic aberration is not a proof of tampering, forgery, or data alteration. And all the other things we saw in the Illustrator view, I already demonstrated that previously. I'll just show it quickly again. Here you have a file where you have layers, you have clipping paths, you have externally linked files with rotation and scaling history, and here it's 24%. In the background it's 12%, so this difference in scaling is also present. So all of these other Illustrator effects, they can be created by a simple optimization as well. And another finally interesting thing is when you open up this thing in Photoshop and you just really pull up the contrast. I'm doing this with levels here a bit. You will basically find that you can see traces of that green pattern which you find in the Whitehouse document. And you can also see this line. A lot of people have been talking about the significance of this line here, that there's a difference between the background, that this would prove data alteration and tampering. Basically, it looks to me as if this was just placed on top of something. And you can also even see, if you scroll down, that there's something here in the background which says something with certificate again. So whatever. I mean, it's just present in the paper. You really have to, if you want to know what was lying here in the background, I don't know, you have to fly to Hawaii. But all of this really doesn't seem to have anything to do with changing the numbers here, which is really what the claim of forgery means, that here these names don't belong here, and there were originally different names and dates here, and they were replaced. And all of the so-called proof for that turns out to be probably just processing. And I really have the impression that there are a bunch of people out there who just want this thing to be forged, and they will just keep on looking. They will just keep on looking at pixels, and they'll always find something that is going to be definite proof that it has to be forged.